Hello and welcome to Warpath, a podcast dedicated to the history of the Buffalo Sabres. The show is going to explore the games, players, personalities, and stories of over 50 years of NHL hockey in Buffalo. So without further ado, I present to you Warpath, the history of the Buffalo Sabres.
My brother Norrie and I are by no means known as gamblers. However, in 1970, we gambled that Buffalo would be a great place for a National Hockey League franchise.
Corner Robert going after it, he scores! Corner Robert! A backhand in front! Hasek with a miraculous save! Here come the Buffalo Sabres!
Episode 1, The Founding. To tell the story of the Buffalo Sabres founding, you really have to start in 1965, when the National Hockey League announced plans to expand from their original 6 teams. It was June 25th, 1965, when the NHL declared their intentions to expand the league, a date which would set forth nearly 5 years of diligent work to bring the NHL to Buffalo. Led by Seymour H. Knox III and his brother Northrop, the Niagara Frontier Hockey Corporation began pursuit of one of the coveted spots in the NHL's upcoming expansion class. The Knox brothers were born in East Aurora, New York, to one of Western New York's most wealthy families. Their grandfather was the co-founder of the Woolworth Company and later served as chairman for Marine Trust Corporation, better known as Marine Midland Bank. It was a position their father would later hold as well. Like their father, both Knox boys would attend Yale. In fact, Northrop played goalie for the Bulldogs hockey team for 2 seasons. The club's original media guide described Seymour as an avid hockey fan, whose hockey career was cut short by a football injury, though it may be fair to say that his brother was maybe the more accomplished athlete overall. The Knox family was deeply entwined in the sport of polo. Seymour II was an extremely accomplished player in his own right, playing as part of the 1933 U.S. Open champions. Both Seymour III and Nortie would carry on the family legacy, appearing in a pair of U.S. Open finals themselves. The family's love of polo and their home club would eventually have an influence on their hockey team, as they borrowed the blue and gold colors of the Aurora Polo Club for the Sabres uniforms. Nortie was particularly skilled in polo, earning international accolades for his exploits in the sport. He is noted as the only post-World War II amateur to reach an 8-goal rating, which is a rating system used within the sport to evaluate players. He would later serve as chairman of the U.S. Polo Association, before eventually being elected to the Museum of Polo Hall of Fame in 1994. His athletic prowess extended to the sport of court tennis, or real tennis, where he was a 3-time world champion. The Knox family was one of the most influential in Western New York, and they remain an influential family to this day. They have deep ties to the business and cultural community, one of the most notable being the AKG Art Gallery, which bore the family's name as the Albright Knox Art Gallery for many, many years, thanks to the involvement and influence of Seymour II. Seymour's business career eventually led him to a vice president position with Dominic and Dominic. They were one of the world's oldest financial service institutions, and even with the family's generational wealth and status in the community, it was going to be no easy task to bring together the necessary financing for an NHL club. Any ownership group bidding for the expansion class of 1967 were going to face a number of challenges, and Buffalo was not unique to this. They would not only need to bring together financing for the club, but they would also have to fund arena renovations and run down a number of other complications related to bringing an NHL team to Buffalo, New York. But by the time they were prepared to file their application, the Buffalo contingent wasn't just satisfied with their submission, they were extremely confident in the bid that they were going to place to the NHL. This is something that's actually noted by Seymour Knox in an essay titled Anatomy of a Franchise, which appears in the 1970-71 media guide. It quotes, "At the time of the initial franchise application, we were informed that we were the best financed, prepared, and well-liked group among the applicants." Of course, as most of you know, the Knoxes were shut out of the 1967 expansion class. Their bid was not accepted by the NHL. In fact, they weren't even the first alternate. That honor went to the city of Baltimore and their application. So the question then becomes, what went wrong? What kept the Sabres from earning expansion in 1967? What turned the tide against them? It was actually kind of an odd turn of events. Given the preparation the group had committed to and the added success of Buffalo's AHL franchise, the Bisons, they had success for well over 20 years. It turned out that really it wasn't perhaps anything that the Buffalo group had done, but it was something that the groups they were competing against had done. And in this case, in the 1967 expansion class, it was politics. Just another quick history lesson here. As a reminder, the class of 67 consisted of the Philadelphia Flyers, Pittsburgh Penguins, Minnesota North Stars, St. Louis Blues, Oakland Seals, and the Los Angeles Kings. As that sorts out, it's a pair of teams on the East Coast, 2 in the Midwest, and then 2 on the West Coast of the United States. The league's expansion was geographically balanced, meaning that any bids from eastern cities such as Buffalo were effectively competing for one of 2 spots. And as the expansion process played out, the Buffalo bid was indeed a strong one. I think that Knox's quote in that essay, Anatomy of a Franchise, may be a bit of bluster, but there was fact based in it as well. And thanks to the strong bid that the Sabres had, or the Buffalo group had, I should say, it was stated that both Buffalo and Baltimore were seen as the favorites for the second Eastern selection alongside Philadelphia. That is where Jack McGregor, founder of the Pittsburgh Penguins, ultimately flexed his political muscle. McGregor was a Pennsylvania state senator. He was behind the push to bring the NHL back to Pittsburgh as the Pirates had relocated to Philadelphia in 1930. His work to bring in investors to his endeavor wasn't all that different than the work being done by the Knoxes just a few hours north. And like Buffalo, Pittsburgh was already home to an AHL franchise, in this case the Hornets, so a home rink was in place, and with investors lined up to back his application, McGregor had the framework for an application. Again, much like the group in Buffalo. But with Baltimore and Buffalo ultimately seen as a stronger candidate ahead of Pittsburgh, McGregor needed to find an alternative to swing the votes in his favor. And ultimately, it was swinging the votes of the existing 6 owners in the NHL. And this is where the political play comes in. Among the many initial investors and stakeholders in the Pittsburgh Penguins, one of them was Art Rooney, owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Through his ties in horse racing, Rooney was friends with brothers Jim and Butch Norris, who owned the Chicago Blackhawks and Detroit Red Wings, respectively. Rooney placed a call to the Norris brothers on behalf of the Pittsburgh ownership group with one last lobbying effort for their bid. McGregor told USA Today in 2017 that Rooney called Jim Norris and said, quote, "It would be a personal insult to me if you chose Buffalo over Pittsburgh." Whether or not there were other lobbying efforts made in addition to those phone calls, I can't be quite sure. The historical record doesn't necessarily reflect that, but if nothing else, that phone call was enough to swing the votes needed in favor of Pittsburgh and shut Buffalo out of the 1967 expansion class. Now, perhaps 50 years later, it's easy for this to be water under the bridge, or perhaps your Buffalo fandom runs deep enough that you would still hold a grudge against the Rooneys, the Penguins, and the Steelers for shutting the Knoxes out of the class of 1967. Perhaps the fabric and history of both franchises would be completely different had things unfolded differently and the Sabres had been a 67 expansion team and the Penguins had been a 1970 expansion team. It's impossible to say, but it is a very interesting anecdote and an interesting tidbit to consider within the deeper lore of the Buffalo Sabres franchise. And that disappointment didn't discourage the Knoxes, not at all. They persevered. They formed a relationship with the Pastor brothers who owned the Buffalo Bisons in hopes of forging a stronger relationship and stronger ties to the NHL's Board of Governors. The Bisons had been an active NHL farm team, and through those ties between the AHL club and the NHL teams, the Knoxes saw a path to future expansion. The Bisons at that time were one of the AHL's strongest clubs and were one of the first tenants of the newly built Memorial Auditorium in 1940. They called that old barn home for the next 30 years until the Sabres ultimately began play. The Bisons were founded in 1940, 4 years after the Buffalo Bisons of the then International Hockey League ceased operations. That particular iteration of the Bisons was formed in 1928. They actually played their games across the river in Fort Erie at the Peace Bridge Arena, and the IHL Bisons enjoyed some success of their own. They won a pair of league titles in 1932 and 1933, but they would lose their home in the spring of 1936 when a snowstorm caused the roof to collapse. And by December of 1936, the Bisons had folded, as without a home arena, they couldn't survive. And despite the location of their arena being in Canada, they weren't the only professional hockey team to call Buffalo home ahead of the AHL's Bisons. In fact, the Buffalo Majors of the then American Hockey Association played their home games at the Broadway Auditorium, but they only survived for 2 years, playing from 1930 to 1932. There was even a very brief crosstown rivalry between the Bisons and the Majors, though it lasted for a very, very brief period of time due to the financial instability of the Majors. As tumultuous as those years would have been for those two competing teams, it still laid the foundation for success for the sport of hockey in Western New York and specifically in the city of Buffalo. And ultimately, that foundation is what allowed the Buffalo Bisons to be purchased and moved to Buffalo and ultimately flourish once they arrived. You may actually recognize the name of the owners who brought the Bisons to Buffalo initially. Louis Jacobs, owner of Sports Service, bought the Syracuse Stars franchise and moved the club to Buffalo in 1940. And the Jacobs name certainly should stand out to hockey fans, as Louis Jacobs is the father of Boston Bruins owner Jeremy Jacobs. Sports Service ultimately became the concessions giant Delaware North, headquartered still to this day in Buffalo. The Bisons would eventually come to be owned by the Pastor brothers, who also owned the local Buffalo Pepsi bottling franchise. It was that connection that led to the iconic Buffalo bottle cap jerseys the team wore. On the ice, the Bisons were nothing short of brilliant. The club was a regular competitor in the AHL postseason. They made a total of 9 appearances in the Calder Cup finals, hoisting the trophy 5 different times. The Bisons' first title came in the 1942-43 season in a 3-0 series sweep of the Indianapolis Capitals. They would repeat as champions with yet another sweep in 1943-1944, this time toppling the Cleveland Barons. The Bisons would return as champions in 1945-46, thanks to a 4-3 series win over Cleveland, and then again in 1962-63 with another 7-game series win, this time triumphing over Hershey. Their final title came fittingly in the 69-70 season, their last in Buffalo, where they would win their final game to complete a sweep of the Springfield Kings by a score of 6-2. As referenced earlier, throughout their existence, the Bisons had been a farm team for an NHL club that included affiliations with the Montreal Canadiens, the Chicago Blackhawks, and the New York Rangers. The Knoxes were certainly hoping the ties the Bisons, and then therefore their owners, had with their NHL compatriots would serve them well the next time they made a foray into NHL ownership. And lucky for them, they wouldn't have to wait long. On the West Coast, the Oakland Seals weren't finding life to be all that easy in the NHL. They were struggling at the box office, and their owner, Barry Von Gerbig, was searching for a buyer not long after bringing the team to the National Hockey League. There were a host of issues that had plagued the Seals from their inception, and ultimately they became a target of not one, but 2 NHL-hungry ownership groups. The first group to make an approach was the Labatt Brewing Corporation. They came forward with a bid to buy the team, with the sights set on moving them to Vancouver. Like the Knoxes, the ownership group in Vancouver had been shut out of the 1967 expansion class. And it was the behind-the-scenes maneuvering from the ownership groups in both Buffalo and Vancouver that helped to lay the framework for the NHL's expansion class in 1970. The NHL prevented that sale from going through, as they were committed to the 2 California markets they had selected. But in 1969, another sale was brokered. This time it was the Knox brothers who had come forward. They made an offer for $3.5 million for the Seals. And again, Seymour Knox's Anatomy of a Franchise essay from the 70-71 Media Guide tells some of the story of the brothers' attempts to buy and then move the Seals. He writes, "Much has been written about our participation with the Oakland franchise. In October 1968, our group signed a contract to purchase the Oakland club. Our ultimate goal was to move the Seals to Buffalo through a transfer of the franchise. However, the NHL Board of Governors remained adamant that the franchise would not be relocated from the Bay Area. Battle number 2 was lost, and in losing, we inherited reparations amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, as well as a franchise located 3,000 miles from home." In an article for The Athletic detailing the Knox's attempts to move the Seals, John Vogel explores a number of different factors and aspects to the story. One of the things that he is keen to point out is how different Buffalo's history could have been. Not dissimilar to the point made earlier about the Pittsburgh Penguins and their last minute swoop of Buffalo's potential spot in the 67 expansion class, this too illustrates just how different this franchise's 50 plus years of history could have been had the NHL not blocked the Knoxes from moving the Seals to Buffalo. For one, Gilbert Perreault likely would not have been a Buffalo Sabre, and there would have been so many more instances of the early days of the Buffalo Sabres franchise being markedly different had the city inherited the Golden Seals as opposed to a brand new expansion franchise in 1970. The roadblock for the Knoxes was the league. The NHL was committed to the Bay Area due in part to a television contract with CBS. In addition, allowing the Seals to move east would maroon the Kings as the only NHL team on the West Coast. John Vogel's article in The Athletic makes another valuable point in this regard. The NHL would stand to make much more money from expansion fees from future ownership groups, specifically in Buffalo and Vancouver, than if they would have allowed either of those groups to buy and move the Seals. And as evidenced by those attempts to move the Seals, it was clear to the NHL that they had two ready and willing expansion participants in both Buffalo and Vancouver, in addition to the previously interested parties that they had in other cities, such as Cleveland and Baltimore. As one piece of housekeeping, as somewhat referenced by Knox's passage from Anatomy of a Franchise, the Knoxes did ultimately become partial owners of the Seals. They ended up with a 20% stake of that club. Vogel's article goes on to quote Seymour Knox from a press release related to their purchase of the Seals. It says, quote, "It is no secret that our main effort is to eventually bring Major League Hockey to Buffalo, but it won't be the Oakland Seals. The Seals are staying in Oakland. We are happy to remain active in hockey, and we hope that one day in future expansion of the National Hockey League, we will be able to launch a franchise in Buffalo." Those hopes would come to fruition. After a short period of time serving as vice chairman of the Seals and Seymour also serving as an alternate governor for the club, the Knoxes would sell their shares in the team. That sale would help earn funds necessary to fund a future expansion bid, which they were preparing for the class of 1970. As an aside, somewhat ironically, Ralph Wilson was among a group of initially interested buyers for the Seals when they came back up for sale, though ultimately his group did not go through with their purchase. They weren't chosen as the group to buy the club. And all of the league's efforts to keep the Seals in Oakland and in the Bay Area would ultimately fail. It was just not a marriage meant to last, unfortunately. The team changed hands a number of times. They just couldn't get it right. Part of that even goes back to where they chose to play initially, moving to the newer building in Oakland as opposed to staying in San Francisco, which was seen as a slightly more healthy hockey market of the two neighboring cities. That's a very interesting story in and of itself. There are a number of really good sources that you can dig into if you care to learn more about the brief life and ultimate demise of the Golden Seals. But I felt it was important to point that out, that despite all of those efforts by the league, all of the work that they did to keep the Seals from moving to Vancouver, to keep them from moving from Buffalo, ultimately fell short. And maybe something of a spoiler, again, if you're listening to this as a Sabres fan, you know that the Sabres do earn expansion in 1970. But when the Seals ultimately moved in 1976, it was to Cleveland, one of the cities that had been pursuing the league for expansion, just as the groups in Buffalo and Vancouver had done in previous years. There's another interesting point noted in John Vogel's article, and it ties back to the legwork the Knoxes had been doing since they had been defeated in their bid for expansion in 1967. In purchasing the Seals, they had earned even more access to the NHL Board of Governors, meaning they were able to forge the necessary relationships to garner votes needed to be successful in expansion the next time around. And truthfully, it was not long until their hard work was going to be rewarded. All of the efforts from the ownership groups in both Buffalo and Vancouver had made it clear that the league could sustain additional expansion, and on September 11th, 1969, the NHL officially announced that they would be expanding once again, this time for the 1970-71 season. As you may note from the beginning of the episode, this is a much, much quicker turnaround time than was granted for the 1967 expansion class. The league was providing interested parties a mere 3 months to prepare their bids and submit them for expansion, a drastically shorter period of time for any interested parties when compared to the nearly 2-year runway provided for the 1967 expansion class. Perhaps not an apples to apples comparison, as the league was planning their first foray into expansion in 1965 as they were looking ahead to that class of second six teams, whereas in this case they had at least two extremely interested ownership groups in two different cities. Another callback to earlier in the episode, when you think about the balanced geography of the class of 67, Buffalo and Vancouver, of course, residing on two ends of the continents, allowed the NHL to keep that balance, even though the first year of play, those two teams both played in the East Division of the NHL. Still, that balanced geography probably played a role in the league's interest as well. But even beyond Buffalo and Vancouver, you still had Baltimore and Cleveland as two interested cities, among others who had submitted bids in 1965 for the 67 expansion class. But minimally, you had Buffalo, Vancouver, Baltimore, and Cleveland certainly as very interested parties in putting their hat in the ring once again for NHL expansion. And while we know the Sabres and Canucks ultimately were the two teams awarded expansion in 1970, Cleveland and Baltimore weren't shut out. Baltimore, by virtue of the expansion team in Washington, D.C., the Washington Capitals, as we all know them today, were awarded a team in 1974. And by 1976, the California Golden Seals, after 3 separate ownership changes, were finally allowed to move, giving Cleveland their NHL franchise. But still, that 3-month window provided to ownership groups for the 1970 expansion was a very, very short window of time. Even with the legwork that these groups had done in the prior 2 to 5 years, it was still going to require a lot of legwork to ensure that the funding and investors and stakeholders were still going to be lined up for a successful bid. And strictly speaking for the Buffalo group, this also was just months after the Knoxes had formally launched their bid to buy the Seals and then move them to Buffalo. There is some misreporting on the timeline. Some sources say the Knoxes launched their bid and made their offer to the Seals in 1968. Some sources indicate it was 1969. It's hard to indicate exactly which offer at which time is the correct one for this particular practice. But suffice to say, it was within the last 12 months that the Knoxes had made a formal $3.5 million offer to buy the Golden Seals. And between then and September of 1969, the NHL came to them again and said, "We're ready to accept more expansion bids," and effectively saying, "We hope you're ready." It wasn't an easy 3 months for the Niagara Frontier Hockey Corporation. Like in 1965, the Knoxes had to compete with Baltimore and Cleveland as additional expansion candidates. Though as a group which was lauded for their preparation for the class of 1967, they knew it needed to be accomplished this time around. As Knox wrote in the 70-71 Media Guide, among the most important problems that faced us were 1. Could we enlarge our group to include sufficient investors willing to risk nearly $9 million? A very quick note here, the expansion cost alone for the class of 1970 was $6 million. That was 3 times more than the fee in 1965. And as mentioned earlier, and then as you'll see in the rest of this list, the Sabres group, the Buffalo group, I should say, had several other expenses lined up in addition to that initial $6 million fee they would have to pay to the league. And all of this is still amazing to think about in retrospect when you think that the Seattle Kraken paid $650 million to enter the NHL. Number 2 from Knox's essay. Could we persuade the city administration and common council to renew its original commitment to expand Memorial Auditorium to a minimum of 15,000 seats as required by the NHL and generally renovate the building to NHL standards? 3, could we negotiate a lease that would be fair to the city and fair to our investors? 4, could we purchase the Buffalo Bisons at a realistic price? 5, could we work out a reasonable settlement to satisfy the territorial claims of the AHL? 6, most importantly, could we satisfy ourselves that Buffalo fans would remain loyal during our formative years? That was quite a list to tackle, but one the group managed to satisfy. In addition to the Knoxes, the team's founding was aided by individuals like club vice president Robert Oswados and eventual board of directors members Edwin Andrews, Peter Andrews, George Collins, John Fisher, Robert Rich Jr., Howard Saperston, Robert Schmann, Paul Sholkoff Jr., George Strawbridge Jr., and Arthur Victor Jr. Luckily for the Knoxes, there wasn't much more drama once the league awarded Buffalo their team. And that official confirmation came from the NHL on December 2nd, 1969. There was some pushback in finalizing renovations to the Odd. Go figure, a project in downtown Buffalo had pushback. And there were some moments where financing was a bit of a headache. But ultimately, history doesn't paint a terribly dramatic picture for the Knoxes once they earned that expansion acceptance in December of 1969. Really, the only true hiccup that the team did encounter in those final weeks and months of preparation was the delay in renovating the Memorial Auditorium. The team had to play at reduced capacity for their first season, but the final renovations were complete for 71-72. Other than that, though, the Knoxes and the rest of their ownership group had things really well buttoned up. As referenced before, this was an incredibly prepared group. Not only thanks to the diligence of the Knoxes, but Robert Swados played a massive role in the final pieces of preparation in the formation of this franchise. All of those names that were listed played a significant role in the foundation of this team. But Swados in particular were very, very influential in the formation of the Buffalo Sabres, and really the only two people that would surpass them in terms of their desire to bring hockey to Buffalo, the NHL hockey to Buffalo, I should say, and their desire to launch this franchise, of course, were Seymour and Northrop Knox. The official franchise certificate, an item with its own interesting history and lineage, is dated May 15th, 1970. The original document given to the Knoxes by the league was owned by the Knox family, as you would expect, and unfortunately, due to as quoted by the Buffalo News, a calamity of errors, Seymour Knox IV lost the rights to the storage locker many of those items were kept in, and at auction, their certificate was purchased by Dave and Adams, which locals here in Buffalo will know as a memorabilia and trading card superstore. So they are now the owners of the original franchise certificate that was awarded by the NHL to the Buffalo Sabres ownership group. And the franchise certificate, for those of you who are curious and if you've never looked it up before, it looks like a really basic certificate that you might get as like a high school diploma even, but it's titled National Hockey League, and it reads as follows. This is to certify that Niagara Frontier Hockey Corporation, owning and operating a professional hockey club in the city of Buffalo, in the province or state of New York, having duly complied with all the conditions pertaining to membership in the National Hockey League, this certificate evidences the right of said Niagara Frontier Hockey Corporation to membership and franchise in said National Hockey League under the provision of its Constitution, subject to all the terms, conditions, and requirements of the Constitution. This membership may be transferred and assigned in accordance with the terms and conditions of the Constitution of the National Hockey League. And that is dated again May 15th, 1970, and it's signed by Clarence Campbell, president of the National Hockey League. That document changed hands in the 2020s. That's when the auction took place and when Dave and Adams made the purchase. But its receipt in 1970 marked another major milestone for the Sabres ownership group. The Sabres began play on October 10th, 1970, a day that truly brought to close a long winding road for the Sabres owners. And of all the fascinating bits and pieces of all this, the political play by Art Rooney and the Penguins ownership, the multiple attempts by the Knoxes to purchase the Golden Seals and move them, what all of this comes down to, again, as I kind of just stated previously, was the incredible diligence that the Knox brothers had to get this thing over the finish line. It was a really, really impressive amount of work that they had to take on, not only in the fundraising and the formation of their ownership group, but as Knox mentioned in that Anatomy of a Franchise list, they had to obtain the proper approvals and funding to improve and expand the Memorial Auditorium. That building was built to hold a much smaller capacity than it ultimately did in its final days. They had to raise the roof. They had to do so much to bring that up to par for the NHL. That was a massive undertaking. There was an active professional hockey team in the city that was very successful. They ultimately became players within that franchise because they had their eyes on an NHL club. So all of these things, from the very, very first pieces of inception of the franchise right on through that bid for expansion in 1967, it just tells the tale of this incredibly determined effort by Seymour and Northrop Knox. They deserve so much credit for the work that they did to ultimately bring the NHL to Buffalo. Thank you for tuning in to this first episode of Warpath. Links and additional details on reference materials for this episode can be found in the show notes. References for the episode include the Buffalo Sabres 1970-71 media guide, the Sabres 40th anniversary website, The Athletic, USA Today, PittsburghHockey.net, GoldenSealsHockey.com, and the Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame. Next time on Warpath, we explore the original crest and colors of the Buffalo Sabres.